My name's Tom Tugendhat. I'm the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the British House of Commons. I'm a member of Parliament. I represent a community in West Kent, the community of Tunbridge and Morling. It's a community made up of some 75,000 people, about an hour and a half outside London, of 3 major towns and about 30 or so villages. It's an interesting part of the world because it's fundamentally connected, of course, to 2 major areas of the British economy. The first, of course, is the city. A lot of people in the community I represent commute into London every day, and they work in finance, insurance, and the law, accountancy, other areas that are dependent on the city. And the second area that I represent in many ways is an agricultural community. A lot of fruit farming, particularly soft fruits, berries, but also we're very famous for apples and pears. And the reason I mention that is because I think it's always important when you're dealing with politicians to know who it is that they represent, or what it is that they fill their day with, if you like, other than Parliament. And for me, it's very many issues connected to those 2 fields. But there is a third, and that's that the town of Tunbridge is a very famous education centre. So we have a lot of very, very good schools, very front-rank schools. The School of Tunbridge itself, of course, but also schools like Judd and Tunbridge Girls' Grammar and so on. And the reason I mention that as well is because, again, that adds an extra dimension. So those 3 influences, 2 economic activities, if you like, and 1 very important social activity, are the principal focuses of the area I represent. Now, that may sound like a very national way of looking at it, but the reason I bring it up is because I think it feeds directly into my work as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, because there are many areas from that the economics play into our foreign policy. And that's why I wanted to start off by explaining who I am. Let me now go on and say what I'm seeing in the world, and then I'll bring the 2 together. The way I'm looking at the world today is a fundamental change from the way we've looked at it together really over the last 70 years. If you look at the post-war settlement, if you look at the post-1945, or in some ways, in fact, post-1940 period, when the beginnings of the discussions about the United Nations started, the beginnings of the discussions of things like the European Convention on Human Rights, the beginnings of the discussions on even the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Some of them started, of course, during the Second World War. Some of them started almost immediately afterwards. You see the beginning of a pattern where you see the world coming together. You see the shock of the destruction, of conflict, the pain of division being overcome by countries beginning to work together in new and different ways, taking the lessons of the League of Nations, taking the lessons, indeed, of many of the old unions that had dominated the world, whether they be unions like the Holy Roman Empire or the Frankish Union, or indeed various different forms of union around the world, and looking at a better way of doing it, a more structured way of doing it. And various ideas came out of that, and we know many countries were instrumental at the beginning, not least, of course, the United Kingdom, in helping to establish some of these organizations. The most obvious, of course, is the United Nations, which was established then in that immediate post-war period as a replacement for the League of Nations and met for the first time in Westminster in the Methodist Central Hall. That political structure, that international council, if you like, that union, really symbolized the beginning of a new era in global politics, a moment when the world itself, the countries tried to come together in a different form of alliance. And since then, you've seen evolutions of it. You've seen the evolution of the GATT into the WTO. We've seen the evolution, the creation of organizations like NATO. We've seen the organizations like the World Bank and the IMF come forward, and then most recently, of course, organizations like the AIIB as the sort of latest expression of this. But we've also seen some very severe changes. And I would argue that in many ways that period that started in 1940, depending on which organization you pick, but really 1945, evolved through the 1970s and came to its apex from 1990 to really 2010, is beginning to be very seriously challenged. And that's the organisation, that's the period, the era of organisations, the era of multinationalism. And I think that it's coming to a challenge, as we see around the world in various different ways. The most obvious from a UK perspective is, of course, the Russian challenge to international order. We're seeing a regime in Russia which is fundamentally attacking many of the agreed norms in Western politics, certainly, but actually in global politics as well. It's the first country that has changed a border of Europe by force since 1945. It's the first country that has really conducted aggressive cross-border activities in the sense of cyber attacks on Estonia, attempted murders, and murders in the UK, attempted murders of a prime minister in Montenegro, and many other different events, including, of course, bringing down a civilian airliner over Ukraine and occupying half of that country and about 20% of Georgia. So it's really fundamentally challenging the world order. But let's look at this hard. Is that on its own enough to talk about an era change? I don't think it is. I think what we're seeing is an era change because we're seeing that expression of change reflected in other parts. So we're seeing it in China. When you look at China today, there are two ways of looking at it. The first is to say, well, China wasn't really at the table in many ways in the 1940s for very obvious reasons. It was very severely harmed in the Second World War. In many ways, it was the country that suffered most from certainly first, and in many ways, most from some of the destruction of the Japanese Empire at the time. And it was a very, very broken country in that post-war era. And then as the international order was reframed and reordered in the 60s and the 70s, China was either going through a civil war or later going through the Great Leap Forward, which was a moment of huge change. So China wasn't really a participant in many ways in the world order until we get to the 2000s, when suddenly China's membership of the WTO and integration into the world order starts to change the Chinese economy in a very radical sense. And that's when China really begins to play a rightful part in the world order that we see. And so it's at that point that we start to find the challenges start to arise. Initially, they're not significant because China is a developing economy and we don't feel the pressure. But over time, issues like intellectual property start to actually matter. They matter because the Chinese economy is now big enough. They matter because the state is assisting that economy in various different ways in various forms of corporatism. And so we begin to feel the effects of that pressure against the existing order. Now, some of that pressure, as I say, is legitimate. Some of that pressure is reasonable if you weren't, after all, part of the rules as they were written in the 40s and again in the 70s and so on. It's not unreasonable to say, look, now as the second largest economy and probably soon to be the largest economy in the world, you have a right, a very legitimate right, to see some of those rules rewritten so that China's place should be appropriately reflected. But some of it is not legitimate. Some of it is actually directly challenging. And there it's not just looking at things like the World Trade Organization, where we know very much the challenges of intellectual property or the challenges of foreign companies operating within China. It's when you look at other things, and here I'm specifically thinking of areas like the law of the sea. The law of the sea, as we know, was set down more recently by various UN treaty and charter and agreed internationally and guaranteed various territorial rights, various maritime rights, various mining and fisheries rights. And one of the things it did is it set down stipulations as to how far territorial waters extend off continental shelves. This has become an issue of late because of the various island groups off the Chinese mainland, off the Chinese continent, that have begun to grow. Unusually for islands, these islands are beginning to get more established. They're beginning to be solidified into air bases, into ports, as the Chinese government is building up these island groups. Now, the reason this matters is not just for the mineral rights that they give access to, or indeed for the fishing waters that they command, but is due to what it means for the projection of Chinese influence and power, and for what it means for the rest of the world's ability to operate within what China now states are its waters. This is a challenge for the international order because, of course, what it's fundamentally asking is, at what point does international order become subservient to power? Now, in China, by and large, that has not been a question that needs to be asked because actually China has worked very cooperatively through the UN system, through the WTO, and indeed through many others. But this is really the first time that is being challenged. Now, the most obvious movements through the so-called nine-dash line and into various areas have been the United States, of course. The United Kingdom has also played her part in exercising freedom of navigation in those areas. And we're doing it not because we wish to challenge the Chinese, we wish to get on very well with the Chinese, but because if one is to have the rule of law, then the rule of law must apply. And here, the law of the sea has ruled very clearly that this is international waters. So why do I bring this particular example up? Because again, that is a challenge to the rules-based order that we've understood since 1945. Now actually there is a third challenge, and it's a challenge that can be summarized in one name but actually reflects many more, and of course that name is Trump. From the United States, one sees a movement away from many of the international organizations that the United States has been absolutely fundamental to establishing, maintaining, and defending for the best part of 70 years. And that movement, that change, is not just one president who's done it. It's actually a continuation. If one looks, for example, at President Clinton's attempts in the early days to not get drawn into the Balkans. Was that isolationism? No, I think that would be overstating it. It wasn't isolationism, it was reasonable reticence. But it certainly reflected a US idea that it shouldn't get drawn into every European war, and the idea that the Europeans should really look after it themselves. But eventually the United States was drawn in. If one looks at President Bush II and looks at his initial campaign and his first mandate, if you like, not in the sense of electoral terms, but in the sense of eras. His first mandate was actually very brief. Of course, it's the pre-9/11 moment. He was again trying to continue that reticence to get drawn in. 9/11, of course, changed that and got drawn in not just to Afghanistan, but into many other parts of the world. But he was very much part of that reticent generation. And indeed, he hired as his UN ambassador, a cabinet position, as we know, in the United States, John Bolton, a man who then challenged very aggressively the structure of the United Nations and its order. We then see an evolution, of course, through withdrawals from the foreign wars under President Obama, and a greater, if that is the correct expression, a greater lack of intervention under the Obama term. And then now we see President Trump continuing that with challenges not just to the United Nations, but also to organizations like the WTO, and indeed at various points to other trade organizations like NAFTA and so on. And so I bring up those three because those are the three challenges, the three larger challenges to the rules-based system that we've seen evolve really over the last 70 years. And in many ways, there is a danger that we could see the international order that has kept us all safe for 70 years become under threat. And there are various reasons for all three, as I say. In Russia's case, it's because it's a declining economy. It's because the government is failing, because it's effectively a kleptocratic dictatorship, and it's seeking to maintain its diminishing authority through aggression. Exporting violence and playing the nationalist card is not a new trick, sadly. And in China's case, it's due to a reasonable, in some ways, desire to reset its place in the world and to reset the world order with China in a different position. And in the United States' case, it's in many ways a reflection of the truth that is, of course, summed up in that hymn to the American Republic, from sea to shining sea, that idea of American isolationism cut off by two oceans and therefore protected more greatly than any other nation. So in many ways, those three nations encompass the changing themes, the changing dynamics. A wish to defend a position that is failing, a wish to change a position that is no longer sustainable, and a wish to return to an isolationist position. So those are the three challenges. But why do I then talk about my own community when I talk about this? Well, because of course Britain isn't isolated from these winds, and Britain isn't entirely separate from them. What we're seeing in Europe in some ways is part of it. Now, I don't mean that it's part of it in the sense it's as direct an attack on the multilateral system as all that. But what we're seeing in the rise of national identity in the European Union, what we're seeing partly in the UK's vote to leave the European Union, what we're seeing in the rise of various different national movements, whether in France through the National Front, or in Italy through the Lega Lombardi, or now just called the Lega, or what we're seeing through the movements like the AfD in Germany, is that rise of a national identity, that rise of an accountable body that is beneath the multinational organisation. And it raises various questions, and one of the questions for me as chair of the committee is, what does this mean for our participation in multinational bodies? And I think about it in various ways. I think about it in the question as to what are the alternatives to some of these national bodies? What is the accountability of them? And how do people feel that they have the ability to exercise any control, any agency within them? And that's where I think that we're coming to a period where, for many of us who were advocates of an international system, of a multinational system, to share responsibility, to share accountability, and to ensure that friction's diminished, I think we're in a world where we've got to remember that for most people, agency is exercised at a much more local level. Control and power as an individual is exercised at a much more local level. And the wave of globalization that has removed the semblance of control from many people has challenged these multinational bodies, because people now wish to have much more direct, tangible contact between those they elect to take decisions on their behalf and themselves. And that's where I think the challenge has come to the multinational system in Europe. What it is in many ways is the reinvention of the nation state, not necessarily in the same way as the nationalist movements of the 1930s. I certainly don't suggest that. But it is, in many ways, the moment where we've got to learn to love the nation state again. And I say that because actually, when we talk about accountability, one can always invent relationships, and of course, to a certain extent, of course, it's true that nation states are themselves a creation, they are an invention. But they are long-standing inventions, they're long-standing creations, they're ones that we understand, that we feel in our bones, that we can tell stories of, that we can look back on and we can feel identity with. And so they are the valid touchstone from which we do actually, or we are actually able to build up. So there we go. So that's the world as I see it. But why do I bring up Kent? Why do I bring up those industries? Well, the first I brought up was the city. And I don't mean the city just in terms of financial services. In fact, I think financial services, though important, are not the core of it. The core of the city is actually the making of rules, the sharing of risk, and the understanding of cooperation. It's worth remembering that the City of London really didn't grow out of share trading, it grew out of insurance. And insurance, the Lloyd's markets, the coffee shops, as we know, that then became the Lloyd's markets. What it did fundamentally was it allowed individuals who could otherwise not have afforded to send a ship to India, for example, to exploit the spice trades that had just begun to be opened up. They could get together and they could share the risk. And the reason they could share the risk is because they knew that they wouldn't be ruined if it failed. So it suddenly opened up industry to many, many more people, and it did so by effectively creating a system of trust and measurable trust, which is effectively what insurance is, and allowing individuals to cooperate. Now, surrounding that grew up the process of ordering trust, which we call the law, and counting trust, which we call, of course, accountancy. And so those creations, those inventions which grew up around it and became what we now recognize as commercial law and international accounting standards, grew out of that concept of shared trust, shared cooperation, cooperation in insurance, and enabled the UK to then be one of the, well, in fact, in those days, the powerhouse of the global economy. Now, that really matters today because actually what happened then through the massive expansion of British trade, through the empire, of course, but also through commercial relationships with countries around the world, is that Britain really did write the rules. So understandings of what it is to own property, what it is to harbour a ship, what it is to sail goods from one port to another. The principles that underpinned it are effectively principles from the City of London, from the period after the invention of the insurance company in the 1600s. And that's really put the UK at the heart of a global network. And that's the network that the community that I represent still relies on. They rely on it either as accountants or lawyers, some of them in finance and so on. And that's where I come back to multinationalism. Because it was those networks, it was those principles that enabled the creation of the multinational system. It was those networks that enabled British lawyers, in fact, just towards the end of the war, to fly around the world and speak to people about writing the UN Charter that would then create the United Nations. It was those networks that gave the British the concepts of property right and privacy that were then imposed, of course, on the defeated powers and broken powers, not all of them defeated, but broken powers of Europe in 1946-47 with the creation of the European Convention on Human Rights, which was then rolled out in many different ways around the world through various constitutions that imitated or copied or drew from those words. So these inventions, which were underpinned by an understanding of trust, cooperation, and the rules, were created in the 1650s and onwards from the UK, really have underpinned not just international rules, but actually have underpinned many of the concepts of rights that have grown up since. Now, of course, it's not true to say that they're solely an English invention. That's certainly not true. In fact, the original rights documents, like Magna Carta, came from, of course, a French king, and they were later adapted very largely from ideas that evolved in the Sorbonne, were adopted through the French Revolution, through the United States Constitution, and so on. So this is a part of a larger European dialogue, and European writ large here, that has effectively created this rules-based order. But it is still a rules-based order that drew hugely from a certain period of English history and created a set of rules that communities like the one I represent still rely upon. But it's not just our community that relies upon it. The truth is today that every country does, not just countries like India that draw so much legal understanding from the UK, but actually countries around the world which have no real historic link in that sense to the United Kingdom. As we all know, international trade is largely done either directly or through arbitration under English law, English commercial law. And so that order that we helped to shape is something that is now very much in danger. And this is where, as chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, I ask myself, what is the role of the British system? What is the role of the British government? What is the role of our embassies and missions around the world? What is the role of the British people, in many ways, in helping this? And I think this is where, no longer alone, but with allies and partners, we have a particular role in defending the rules, in expanding the orders, expanding the ordered-based system, and making sure that the challenges that we're seeing, whether it's confrontation with Russia, whether it's undermining in China, or whether it's withdrawal from the United States. How do we address that? How do we face that challenge? And I think for the UK today, the correct answer is not alone. If we were to try to do it alone, we would fail in a heartbeat, because the world is not the world of 1650. The world is not about to see the collapse of the Mughal Empire in Delhi. The world is not about to see the scramble for Africa. The world is not about to see the feuding that we saw in China when British gunboats arrived there. We're into a very, very different world. We're into a world of nation states brought into an ordered system, and of nation states equal to the United Kingdom, not better, not worse, but equal to. And so what we've got to do is we've got to look at playing that second role, that networked role, and seeing how we build it up. Now, this is where there is an awful lot of work for people like me and our diplomats to see how do we shape that. But it's not just for us, it's for our whole community, and that's why I brought up education. Because understanding what Britain has done historically is key to moving forward. It's key to understanding how we restore the structures and defend the structures that we value, reinvigorate those that we need, and invent those that we don't have. And that's why I'm very pleased that I'm here, particularly at this time of the 100th anniversary of the First World War, because that is one of those moments of history, one of those moments where we tell each other stories about a past that we can tell in several ways. But we can tell it in ways that unite us, or we can tell it in ways that divide us. And I'd like to tell it in the ways that unite us. Now, you'll see on my collar, I'm wearing a marigold and a Khadi Poppy. The reason for the marigold is clear. It's the memorial flower of the Republic of India, and remembers not just the war dead of the First and Second War, but also those since independence. The Khadi Poppy is an invention this year by a friend of mine, Lloyd, and really brings together that Indian and British tradition. Because what it does is it takes the flower that grew, as we know, immediately after the fighting stopped in Flanders, the poppy, and uses Khadi, the homespun cotton fabric that Mahatma Gandhi made famous. And of course it's important not because of the colour in so many ways, not because of the cloth, but because of the story. Mahatma Gandhi, this extraordinary lawyer who came from South Africa, stopped on his way home in England. But instead of getting home, he stopped in August 14 and created the Indian Ambulance Corps and recruited many, including his wife actually, to serve as nurses or field ambulancemen and women in the First World War. He really exemplified something that we forget or we have forgotten. And that's that although the war wasn't popular, that would be wrong to say, it was certainly widely supported, because it was understood at the time to be very real sense a struggle against tyranny. It was very clear that German militarism and aggression that had grown up since the 1870s had come to a crescendo, and it was now not just challenging the United Kingdom's ally in Europe, France, but it was actually challenging the United Kingdom, and through that the empire. And though people like Mahatma Gandhi clearly weren't a supporter of the empire per se, they knew that there were greater evils than British rule. And indeed he showed this again in the Second World War when he so clearly rejected the Indian National Army and people like Subhash Chandra Bose, when Gandhi was extremely clear on his views that rule by Britain may be bad, but rule by the Japanese would be significantly worse. And so that telling of that story, that telling of that common fight against tyranny, first in the First World War, then in the Second, that telling of the story of what brings us together and what India fought for, what those Indian young men fought and died for, is a way of remembering that actually we're all brought into this system, that we're all part of this, that we're all very much intermeshed in a common history. And it's moving forward from that we're able to address things together. Now, India's relationship with the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom's relationship with India will, of course, always be complicated. And it'll be complicated by horrific abuses and terrible crimes like the murders at Jallianwala Bagh. The choice we have to ask ourselves, and this is why education is so clear, is which story do you wish to tell? Because both are true, but the story you choose to tell defines your future. And that's why I choose to tell the one of unity. Now, the question then is, what does unity mean going forward? And that's a real challenge. I mean, that's a real challenge, because there are many ways of looking at the world and looking at interests. It's possible to look around the world and to say, well, you know, this is a big market, this is an important market, this is an energy supplier, this is a massive consumer of our products. Therefore, these are our partners. And of course, that's partly true. Those alliances, those partnerships of interest are absolutely essential for all countries. But then there's another way of looking at the world and saying, well, these countries with which we do some business, maybe even quite a lot of business, but with whom we actually have very deep values, with whom we share common understandings of things like rights, democracy, freedom of speech. Countries like that, we can have a very much deeper and more substantial relationship. And I think this is where the moment has come for India and Britain to look hard at each other and look hard at our common history and to think seriously about our future. Because I think that there are few countries which exercise democracy as effectively, in a funny way, as India. No system is perfect, but the fact that over 1 billion people vote, I was about to say every 5 years, but actually it's more frequent than that, of course, with state elections and other elections, demonstrates a depth of democratic engagement in this country which is frankly hard to imagine elsewhere. The fact that the Supreme Court, the Chief Justices of India, are able to strike down government decree without fear and able to defend freedom of speech without any concern, speaks to a depth of Indian values on the rule of law and on rights. And I hope the same is seen in the United Kingdom. I would certainly argue that it should be. And that speaks to a depth of relationships that I think allows us to look forward together at the world, challenging those who would challenge the rules that support us and enabling us to plan for the future. Now, this is important for several reasons. One, I think it offers the possibility of a much deeper integration between the UK and Indian people. I think on a cultural and a personal level, I think it would be hard for us to have a closer relationship. I think it's quite clear that we have one of the closest in the world. But I think on an economic basis, I think there's a lot of work to do, opening up our own markets to each other. And I think there's a lot of work to do as well in ensuring a greater flow of information backwards and forwards. And I think that is another area where we must look very hard at how we do this. But I think there's also another area where I think there's work to do. I mean, many people will know that the UK has been a very strong advocate for India taking a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. For me, the argument is extremely clear and obvious, which is power as great as India, a democracy as important as India, and an economy as growing as India's clearly should be represented on the permanent cadre of nations at the Security Council. But before that happens, because as we all know, change can be slow, before that happens, I think there's a real impetus and I think a real importance in India and the United Kingdom working together in the international arena a lot more closely. And the reason I say that is because actually, in many ways, our partnership, our bilateral partnership, would only be improved by the internationalism. But more than that, our individual strengths would also be increased by it. And the reason I say this is because we see the world in a very similar way. We are both fundamentally trading communities. India largely internally, of course, because of the size of the population. The United Kingdom largely externally. But we both fundamentally rely on the stability of the world order to enable our populations to be able to engage in the world and to be able to be happy at home. And I think this is where we've really got to think very hard about how we defend the international rules-based system. Because although there is an awful lot that we could do together, and it's easy to say those are foreign countries about which we need to know little, the reality is if the devil is at your gate, it's not enough just to lock it. You have to do more. And that's why I think there's a real opportunity for us to work together in the international arena to build up a new era of rules-based system, recognizing national rights, recognizing individual accountability and recognizing autonomy, but also recognizing that underlying principles really do matter. And I think this is where we could be an extraordinarily strong partnership. Now, there are challenges to that, of course, and there's an awful lot of discussion to go into how we make that work. But I think we're in a moment in both British and Indian history when actually there is an opportunity for a new opening, when there really is an opportunity for us to engage closely together again. And so, over the next few years, that is one of the areas that I will be working on with the committee. And I will be coming back to India many times, I hope, seeking partners and seeking friends.